Hey, what's going on, guys? So I have encountered a bit of an issue with this series that I've been looking over with the past couple of episodes, and I kind of wanted to address it. So here's my plan. I've been doing a lot of 5x5 mods that don't require, or at least don't necessarily need to require, epoxy sculpt. Now, epoxy sculpt is my favorite material for building puzzles with. It's a very easy to work with material, and of course I am sponsored by epoxy sculpt, so I'm kind of contractually obliged to tell you about it. But I'm not getting the bang for their buck and mine because I'm not actually using it on all of my projects. And the reason for that is I just don't have the time to fill all of the pieces. It's a very labor-intensive and time-intensive process, and even if I can get the epoxy sculpt to cure in time, it still takes many hours to do that, and I just don't have that much time. So I'm in a situation where I can only really do modifications that are a little underwhelming. And I really want to do some crazy and elaborate and ridiculous 5x5 mods. It's not the creativity that I'm lacking, it's the time that I'm lacking. But I think I have a workaround. It's not the best workaround, and it's certainly not the most cost-effective workaround, especially if you're paying for epoxy sculpt. But I'm going to do it anyway. So here's what happens with a typical modification. I do all of the cutting down, and then I fill all of the pieces with epoxy sculpt after I've exposed all of the cavities that I need to fill up. But there's nothing stopping me from just filling all of these pieces beforehand and then cutting it down after it's cured. It'd save me a lot of time because I could do all of the filling off camera, and then all I'd have to do is cut and then go straight into the finishing up. And so that is the solution to my problem. If I don't have the time to fill all of the pieces after I've cut them, then I might as well just fill them beforehand. The only problem is it's a little wasteful because you'll end up cutting off a lot of cubies that will be full of epoxy sculpt that is just going to waste. I'm not really a fan of this approach, but I think in a situation where time is my friend and my enemy, I have to take the approach that best suits the amount of time that I have. Especially with only 24 hours per build, it's a little labor intensive. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to fill up the entirety of a 5x5 with epoxy sculpt. Every single cubie, every single cavity, every single hole, every single thing that doesn't impact the mechanism. I'm not going to fill up anything inside the event horizon, you know, that part of the mechanism that we do not touch, but everything else I'm going to make completely rock solid. I mean, I've filled puzzles to be incredibly solid before, and I was amazed with just how heavy they were, and this puzzle is even bigger than any of those, so I think this is going to be a very weighty puzzle once I'm done. It's so freaking wasteful, but it's definitely going to fix my problem. Am I going to do it to all of the 5x5s in this series? No, I'll probably do it to a couple off camera just to save me some time a little later on in this series, but let's get started. Oh, for frick's sake.
Alright, so for this modification all I was going to be using was epoxy sculpt. That's kind of obvious from the title, but still. And although this may not be a very visually appealing modification, you'd be surprised at just how many people have suggested that I take this approach even before this series started. There's also a lot of people that have asked me to do a video on it because they wanted to try it for themselves. It's a very wasteful approach and I still stand by that, but some people may not have the time to do things properly. So anyways, I feel like I should go into a bit of detail on what I'm going to be doing. There are 5 pieces in this puzzle that need to be modified, and I figure going into depth on each of them will be enough to cover the entire puzzle's build, since it's kind of repetitive if I do it piece by piece. I started by disassembling the puzzle and sorting it out into the pieces that were going to be filled and the pieces that weren't. This is kind of pointless as pretty much every piece was going to be filled, although I didn't include the centers because when you're making a shape mod you typically want to take a lot of time and extra care and attention to making sure the centers are filled correctly because it's not exactly an intuitive thing to do. After I was done with that and I had a big pile of pieces, I got my blade out and I prized all of the caps off the sides of the pieces and I left them in 2 separate piles. The reason I was doing this is just to save epoxy sculpt. I figured that filling the pieces with epoxy sculpt and then using the cap to compress and squeeze out the excess would mean I used less epoxy sculpt overall. I got the epoxy sculpt out and I mixed up a semi-decent amount to fill some of the pieces. I wasn't going to fill them all up in one hit because I figured that the epoxy sculpt would harden before I finished all of them, so I decided to do them in smaller batches. I figured I'd go with each individual kind of piece since there were 5 different kinds that I was going to fill, and there would be 5 batches, so that kind of made sense. I got my clamp out, which would help with squeezing out all of the excess epoxy sculpt, and the first piece that I was going to be filling was the center edge piece. Now there are 12 of these, and they're arguably the easiest to fill because they're the largest and easiest to clamp, so I figured it would be a good place to start. In order to fill it, it was really straightforward. I just filled the piece with epoxy sculpt and then placed the small cap on the outside. I slowly clamped it down and allowed the excess epoxy sculpt to squeeze out the small hole in the bottom. I did this to all 12 of them, and I tried to speed up the process by using a vise to squeeze multiple at a time, but this just really wasn't worth my time in the end, so I went straight back to the clamp. But anyways, I filled all 12 of them, and then I placed them in between my clamp in what is the most dangerous setup I've ever put in a clamp, and then I placed all of the pieces in the clamp in the oven. The reason I did this was to cure all of the pieces. I wasn't going to use this method anywhere else in this build, but I figured I'd try it. The next piece that I was going to be filling was the wing piece, or whatever it is. I don't really know what this piece is called. But it was much of the same. I just stuffed it with epoxy sculpt, and then I placed a cap on it, and I slowly squeezed it down. Now this piece I did actually make the mistake of overfilling, and you can see it kind of busted open at the side. Luckily I had enough spare pieces for 5x5s that I could just swap for another one. The next piece that I was going to be filling was the corner. This is much of the same. I just stuffed it with epoxy sculpt and then clamped it down. And now we get to the fun part. The centerpieces are a little more tough to fill, and the reason for this is they have a lot of little tiny cavities, and if you don't stuff them with epoxy sculpt correctly, then you can have air pockets that'll show up once you've cut the puzzle down. So I started with very small pieces of epoxy sculpt, and I slowly stuffed them into each of the holes. Now in this particular case, I'd recommend that you overfill all of the pieces ever so slightly. You'll have to finish them up before reassembling the puzzle, but it's better than underfilling them because you might end up with some very difficult to repair cavities after you've cut the puzzle down. I filled up both kinds of centerpiece, as you can see here, and this is the kind of look you're going for. Now you might notice with some of these pieces there are some large sections that aren't filled. Now the reason I'm not filling all of these parts is because there's really no point. If you're never going to cut down that far, then there's really no reason to fill them in the first place.
Okay, so I have most of the pieces here done. Not all of them, there's still quite a few of the small centerpieces to do, but all the edge pieces are pretty much done. And I'm not going to assemble this puzzle because these little centerpieces here, they have exposed epoxy sculpt, and if I assemble the puzzle, then the exposed epoxy sculpt will sit up against the other pieces, and it'll seize the puzzle up, and I won't be able to use it tomorrow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let all these pieces cure, and tomorrow I'm going to assemble the puzzle, and I'm going to do a shape mod, which is going to be pretty cool.
So that's pretty much it. That's how to fill all of the pieces. I'm sure it's fairly self-explanatory, but there are some people out there that were asking me to make a video on it, so I hope it at least helps some people out there. But anyways, I hope you guys like this puzzle, and I hope you guys like this video, and I hope you find this video informative or helpful in some way. But anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Oh, would you look at that? I made a friend. It's gone.